What I want to talk about really is, we talk about Marx the revolutionary, but also Marx the human being. And the image of Marx that's often put forward by the mainstream is of a white bearded man sitting aloof in the British Library, writing away. But in reality, he was an active revolutionary and learned from the struggles breaking out in the world around him. The mainstream also tend to focus on Marx's economic ideas and theory of economic crisis. But in reality, his theories of capitalism and economics were completely intertwined with his political ideas of the need for revolutionary change and the working class as the driving force for that change. Marx wanted to understand the world, he wanted to uncover the dynamism of the force of capitalism into crisis, but he also wanted to change the world. He famously wrote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world, but the point is to change it." One of his most unique insights was how the working class could liberate itself through struggle, bring about revolutionary change, and get rid of capitalism. Marx was clear that people and our ideas are shaped by the material circumstances within which we live, and this was as much true for Marx himself as it is for the rest of us. Now, Marx was born in 1918 into a world that looked very different from the world that we know today. He was the son of a well-off Jewish family in Trier in Rhineland in Germany. And Germany was not the country that we know it today. It was not a unified country at all. It was made up of separate states and principalities and was incredibly backward economically and subject to autocratic rule. He was politicized through his criticism of the oppressive Prussian state within which Rhineland existed. And when he finished his university education, he started editing the newspaper, the Rheinische Zeitung, in which he began to take up the need for greater political freedom in society, grappling with the questions of class, of private property, and of the state. He was influenced by the state's new measures. For example, they were targeting the thefts of wood from the forests, which had been recently privatized. In the past, peasants had been allowed to go and gather as many twigs as they wanted to that fell from the branches, but now anyone who picked up the smallest twig could be expected to a prison sentence. Now, the paper became subject to censors and was closed down in 1843, so Marx and his wife Jenny moved to Paris. France was a society deeply shaped by the revolutions of 1789 and 1830. Paris, therefore, was a really naturally rallying point of that time. Marx came face to face with the reality of a mass working class in a developing industrial society, where communist and socialist ideas were developing, not only among French workers, but also among the 40,000 German workers who had migrated there. Many of the people that he worked with in the past were dismissive of what they saw as politically backward workers. However, Marx was moved by the freshness and nobility of these worker activists who are coming more and more into struggle. For example, there was a small group of Silesian weavers who began to fight for higher pay. A group of weavers marched to the home of the Prussian industrialists and ended up storming and destroying it. And the next day, 5,000 weavers and their families burst into factories and offices and the homes of their bosses, destroying machinery, ransacking, and looting. The industrialists called in the Prussian military, who shot dead 35 protesters. And this was the first revolt of its kind in Germany. And although it failed to win in its demands, for Marx, the fact that the workers were resisting is what was key and is what inspired him. Marx was also deeply shaped by his relationship to Friedrich Engels, who he met in 1844. From Engels, he gained an understanding of the condition of the working class in England, the poverty, exploitation, and misery of those who were driving the productive machine of industrial capitalism. Engels had also been in close contact with the new growing mass movement, Chartism, which was beginning to organize resistance to the horrors of the new society. Marx had a glimpse of the struggle of the workers and of the Silesian weavers. However, Chartism was an example of hundreds of thousands of workers moving into struggle, which looked like it might topple the British state. The strength and the power of the proletariat was made concrete. In 1848, when the Communist Manifesto was published, class struggle, and the role of the working class as the most revolutionary class was at the heart of Marx and Engels' theory. 1848 was also a year of explosive revolution that started in Paris and spread across Europe. Back in Rhineland, Marx threw himself into the struggle. He and Engels had won the leadership of the Communist League, which was an international German revolutionary artisan society. He and Engels first saw their objective in the German Revolution as a fight for a radical democratic bourgeois revolution, or what you might call a German version of the French Revolution of 1789. However, they saw this revolution as the precursor of a workers' revolution. This bourgeois revolution would be achieved through revolutionary war against the backward Tsarist state and would require the mobilization of the masses. Marx revived his old paper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, in which he developed his intervention in the revolution. He agitated against the Prussian state oppression of the Rhineland, criticized the feeble struggle of liberals against the French and German state. And this was all brought home in Paris in June in 1848, when the new French Republic bloodily suppressed the workers' rising. In Germany, the vacillation of the bourgeoisie gave impetus to the Prussian state to intervene and suppress the revolution. So Marx found himself unable to rely on his bourgeois former allies, but he lacked an organization of his own that could drive the revolution forward. In 1849, when he was expelled from Rhineland, he and Engels found their home in England and began to organize with a focus on arming the workers ideologically and organizationally, and they revived the Communist League. They remained committed to the independent working class organization, completely separate to the bourgeoisie, and they saw the success of the revolution as dependent on the working class taking over power of the state and spreading into an international revolution. And this would later form the foundation of Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution that was inspired by looking at the revolution in Russia in 1905, and also Lenin's writing on the state and revolution on the eve of the October Revolution in 1917. And Marx and Engels would then go on, and they set up the First International in 1864, through which they were actively engaged with the struggle against slavery in the US and for Irish liberation. At the same time, Marx was also writing Capital Volume 3. So at the peak of his intellectual work, he was also leading one of the most important movements in the history of the international working class. And I don't know if it's been said before, but I thought this was quite a funny anecdote, that apparently on May Day of 1865, Marx complained to Engels that he was really overworked with both completing his book on the one hand and also the International Association on the other. The question of workers taking power and international revolution was posed sharply again by the Paris Commune in 1871, and Marx praised the Commune as having dismantled the institutions of the bourgeois state and having replaced them with radical new structures, and in some places, direct democracy. Now, Marx is sometimes criticized for developing a determinist theory, that capitalism's contradictions and crises mean that it will naturally collapse into itself and that revolution is inevitable. And if this was the case, we could all just sit back here and wait for the revolution. But what is clear from his life, from his writings, from his activities, is that this is far from the case. Marx did see class struggle as inevitable, but the direction that it would go in was not. Organization and active involvement in struggle was central to his theory, and without an attempt to build an organization rooted in struggle, there was no way he could test his ideas. Today, the question of the state and the struggle is as clear as it was in Marx's time. If we look at Catalonia, if we look at the struggle of French workers or the rise of Corbynism here, the need for a revolutionary theory and organization grounded in the experience of struggle remains a key question for revolutionaries today.
Well, thank you, Naima, and thank you, Emma, and thanks for everyone for being here today. I want to argue that Marx is, yes, a revolutionary for today, and in many ways is more important than when he was writing in the 19th century. Firstly, because we still live in a world of inequality, of war, of racism and crisis, in a sharper form. You'll have seen the figure out last week of inequality in Britain. The richest 1,000 people in Britain now are worth £724 billion, not million, billion pounds, an increase of 10% over the last year. So while everyone else was facing restrictions on their wages and benefits, the people at the top were soaring away. Their wealth has nearly tripled since the beginning of the economic crisis in 2008. And on a world scale, of course, it's even more gross. The latest figure from Oxfam was that 42 people have as much wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. That's the gross inequality that still exists in the world. It's a time of war, not just the appalling things like the shooting down of Gazans by the Israeli state, not just the bombing of Syria, but also, has there really been a time when the world felt closer to the possibility of nuclear war than maybe since the Cuban Missile Crisis, as there is now? It is conceivable that Trump could use nuclear weapons. It's perfectly conceivable that he could. And therefore, this is an extremely urgent question. It's a world of racism, one that we're very, very well aware of, that across Europe, ruling classes in crisis have turned towards racist scapegoating in order to fracture the opposition against them. And on Britain scale, we know the scandal of the Windrush generation, we know the scapegoating of Muslims and migrants, and that this is a pattern that is repeated again and again. And there are problems that Marx himself did not foresee. For example, Marx did actually lay the basis of an understanding of ecology and capitalism, but he could not have foreseen the possibility of climate chaos destroying the whole of the planet. And this is a new thing which capitalism threatens us with. So capitalism is still a force which leads us towards disaster. But in addition, Marxism begins to answer the question of how we can supplant capitalism and fight for a different sort of society. Lenin defined Marxism as the theory and practice of the proletarian revolution. Lenin would have been good on Twitter, in my opinion. 53 characters, that is, to define Marxism. In the old days, when Twitter was real, he only got 141. So he would easily have managed that. The theory and practice of proletarian revolution. It has three very important concepts in it. Number one, it's not just about ideas and it's not just about doing things, it's about both of them together, and both matter. Activity is central. Without action, nothing will happen, but also you need ideas, because the surface reality of capitalism doesn't tell you the reality of the forces that are happening within it, and we need to learn from past experience to discuss ideas. That's why this event is worthwhile. It's not a distraction from activity, it is a crucial element building action, or at least it should be. It could be a boring academic affair, but I hope that it has been nothing of that sort. That's the first point. Second point, theory and practice of proletarian revolution. Not just about small changes inside the world, but about working towards a total overthrow of the existing conditions and creating a different sort of society. Thirdly, proletarian. Marx identifies a class force which is absolutely necessary in order to bring about this sort of transformation. A particular role of the working class, what Marx called the universal class, which had both power to turn off the source of profit and had a collective capacity to work together to change the world in a way that no previous subject class had done. That's why Marxism is still very, very relevant today. Now, I want to talk about two things which, in a sense, are about contemporary politics in a very sharp way about Marx. The first is about racism and oppression. And Alex Kalinikos touched on this in his opening address, but I want to say some more about it because it is a central question that we face as revolutionaries, as socialists in Britain today. The attacks upon Muslims and migrants, the attempt to increase racist scapegoating is a central part of Theresa May's government. The hostile environment was not simply an unfortunate slip, it was a deliberate policy driven by the government in order to try and distract people from their policies. So it matters. Now, what does Marx say about this? If you look at what Marx wrote in the end of the inaugural address of the First International, the International Working Men's Association so-called, he says this: "Past experience has shown how disregard of that bond of brotherhood which ought to exist between the workers of different countries and incites them to stand firmly by each other in all their struggles for emancipation will be chastised by the common discomfiture of their incoherent efforts." By which he meant, unless you unite, you're fucked. That's really what Marx was saying in that question. That it's necessary to overcome all the distinctions of nationality, of race, of religion. If this is not done, then the other side will defeat us. That's true about women's oppression, it's true about homophobia. If these are not overcome, our side is fatally weakened. That's one very, very important question. Then let's look at, Alex again mentioned the question of Ireland. I want to quote from the letter. I have the letter here, not the actual letter, you understand, that would be worth something that Marx wrote, but the words are important because they are eerily prescient about the present day. Here's Marx writing. He says, "Every industrial and commercial centre in England now possesses a working class divided into hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. In relation to the Irish worker, he regards himself as a member of the ruling nation and consequently becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself." It's a very subtle analysis of how, if you identify with your own ruling class over the question of treatment of migrants or people of a different religion, you therefore become the author of your own misfortune. It's a very powerful analysis, and clearly, if the Tories and the capitalists can get workers in Britain today to identify with the hatred of migrants and Muslims, they will then become people who have a fracturing of the working class, which will be only to the benefit of those at the top of society. Marx continues, "This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers." Marx had foreseen the Daily Mail. In short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling class. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and the latter is quite aware of this. In other words, this isn't some side issue to class struggle is going on, oh, and then there's racism and women's oppression and homophobia over there. Not at all. It is integral to the question of fighting back as a class to overcome these restrictions. That is why today the struggle over racism, supporting migrants and Muslims, standing with those who are fighting back against state racism, fighting against the fascists and the Football Lads Alliance and so on, is absolutely central in order to be able to have a working class which can fight back in a unified manner. There's also, though, a corollary to that, which is Marx's vision of overcoming and defeating those divisions is not simply about liberal urging. It is precisely by the struggle against capitalism and ultimately the destruction of capitalism that it's possible to tear out the roots of racism and women's oppression and homophobia and to become a different sort of society freed of racism. On the one hand, workers must take up the struggle against all forms of oppression as part of the process of unifying. On the other, the struggle against oppression must be carried through by the method of working class struggle and ultimately of working class revolution. and therefore the necessity both of a systematic and structured and continual struggle against racism and the class struggle simultaneously. You see, the struggle against racism needs to be specific. Or the struggle against women's oppression needs to be specific. By which I mean, it's not enough to say, one day we'll have more struggle and all these questions will magically be solved. It's not true. You can have quite high level of struggle where such questions are not even raised. And therefore it's the duty of all of us when involved inside whatever struggle it may be to make sure that these struggles are raised and are brought into as part of it. You can't ignore them and hope that somehow it will be solved by a rise in the class struggle. That's one extremely important point. The second thing I want to talk about is the question of revolution and of organisation. Marx didn't write very much about the question of socialist parties, but he did write something important at the end of the Communist Manifesto. He writes this: in what relation do the communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? The communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mould the proletarian movement. The communists are distinguished from the other working class parties by this only: one, in the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the fore the common interests of the entire proletariat, independent of all nationalities. In the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. Now, two important points. Number one, note how he raises centrally as one of only two principles of working class organisation how they overcome the difference between proletarians of the different countries. An internationalist, anti-racist, anti-oppression approach. But you'll notice as well that Marx makes clear here we don't form separate parties. And actually, I am a member of a Socialist Workers' Party, which is a separate party from other parties in the working class. Now, am I breaking from what Marx said, or am I applying what Marx said? I suppose one would always say I'm applying what Marx said. But anyway, it's important to understand that what Marx was trying to do here. Marx was trying to overcome the sectarianism of his age and to unify working class organisation. To overcome the charlatans and jokers who infected the working class movement with their own particular scheme of working class liberation. No, Marx said the working class movement needs to unify. And actually, this is still an important point. Still an important point. We do not take as our badge of honour how many people disagree with us. There are some groups of this sort. We're very, very small. This shows how right we are. Nobody agrees with us. This shows how hard our politics have become. No, that's not our approach at all. In the Socialist Workers' Party, we seek to unite in action with as wide a group of people as possible wherever it's possible to do so. This is still an important consideration for any socialist. But the second point is, Marx had not had the whole history of reformism and of the actions of the capitalist state about those who tried to reform it. So, Marx had not seen the whole history of Labour governments in Britain, for example, or Labour-type governments in other parts of the world. You know, the history of the Labour Party, 1924, 1929, 1945, 1950, 1964, 1966, 1974, once 1974 again, 1997 to 2010, and so on. And at the end of it, we are no closer to socialism. That's the truth. It's the reality about it. Lots of Labour governments, some progress of reforms, of course, but ones that can be snatched away from us quite quickly by governments that come afterwards, and no fundamental assault on the power of capitalism. Indeed, a Labour Party which has walked further away, until very, very recently, from any mention of the fact that the capitalist system itself needs in any way to be confronted. That's one history which Marx did not have and undoubtedly has to be taken into account by anyone who's serious about changing the world. The second thing Marx had not seen was the way in which the capitalist state works to break any party that works through the existing state system in order to crush the attempt at reform. He had not seen the way that the bosses and the state use both economic power and, if necessary, the power of force in order to smash reformist governments. You know, look at the recent example of Syriza in Greece. We know the reality of this. Elected in January of 2015 as the hope of a continent, immense pressure from the unelected forces of the European Union, the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the rich of Greece and across the world, the Ochi referendum, the great no referendum of the middle of 2015, in which the people of Greece reject the austerity plans that have been put before them, and within a few days, the Syriza government accepting a worse austerity program than that of its conservative predecessor. That's not just about Alexis Tsipras. That's not just about Syriza. It's the experience again and again of reformist governments across the world. And actually, Marx is quite helpful about this. Because Marx, Emma mentioned the Paris Commune, the period of a few weeks where workers held power in Paris and were capable of bringing about changes in the interests of working class people, or at least giving a form in which working class people could change the world around them. Marx, at the end of it, suddenly discovers something special about the state, about the system. What he discovers is a new form within which change has to come about. And he says the following about this. The working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. The modern state functions as the national power of capital over labour, a public force organised for social enslavement, an engine of class despotism. The task of the working class is to smash the bourgeois state and establish its own state power, tasked with the expropriation of the expropriators. That's an incredibly powerful understanding that Marx, late on in his life, understood clearly that the existing state system cannot be used to bring about fundamental social transformation, and what is necessary is the smashing of that system and of a different state entirely, a far richer, more democratic, more participatory state system which can lay the basis for the transformation of society into a genuine socialist society. Now, when we think about that today, think of the two bits of what Marx talks about revolutionary organisation. Number one, it's fantastic what's happened inside the Labour Party and the rise of Jeremy Corbyn. Very, very important. A boost to the whole of the left. It shows that left arguments can be popular. It shows our side can win over millions of working class people. And we should seek unity with those people wherever possible and to work alongside them. But point two is also important. If there is a Corbyn government, it will face ferocious opposition from the rich, from the powerful, from the bosses. Already that's happening, and Corbyn isn't even in office. Already it's happening. And it will be intensified 100-fold. Much more than Syriza got. Britain's more important than Greece for the people at the top of the system. And when that happens, all our experience of Labour-type governments is that they will compromise, they will move away from defending those who elected them, and they will make concessions towards the people at the top of society. And therefore, we also need an independent revolutionary organisation which continues to put forward the ideas that Karl Marx learnt from the Paris Commune, that this existing machinery cannot be used to bring about fundamental social transformation. And in addition, that to fight for the sorts of transformation we need requires organisation. It won't come about unless there's organisation in order to achieve it. And therefore, both to raise the level of struggle and to bring about the sorts of changes that Marx talked about, we require revolutionary political organisation. I'll finish with a quote from Karl Marx. He said, a revolution is necessary, not only because it's the only method by which the ruling class can be overthrown, but also because the class overthrowing it can only in a revolution succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages and become fitted to found society anew. And our argument is, if you want to be part of the struggle, to be part of getting rid of all the muck of ages and help to find a way for workers to found society anew, we need that organisation. We need the struggle. We need to learn from the great richness of Marxist politics, but we also need organisation, and that's why we ask you to join the Socialist Workers' Party. Thank you.